presentation is called Giving Students the Wings to Fly on Their Own. So by the end of my presentation, you'll really understand what I mean by this. So this past school year, I was at the Rashi School, which is a small Jewish day school in Dedham, Massachusetts, and I had the privilege of working in a 3rd grade classroom. I had a classroom full of 21 very rambunctious and eager students. And so for my research, I decided to focus in 2 specific areas, their math block and their writing block, which their math block met every single day of the week, and writing was 3 times a week. So my main focus question is, how can I put in place productive routines in math and writing so that students can work independently? So the real focus on these routines and the focus on student independence is what I was really looking at. So why am I focusing on this question? Well, there's a lot behind that. First of all, I found that in my classroom, the students were relying heavily on teacher assistants. There's this big dependence on the teacher. And I saw this in several ways. First being questions. Every time I gave an assignment, there were already many hands in the air. Students wanted to ask questions during that work time. Students were constantly asking questions. And a lot of times, I felt like these were questions students could answer on their own only if they had the skills to do so. So that was something I wanted to try to do, give them those skills. Another thing was this constant request for help. I felt like I'd give an assignment and students would immediately be calling me over. Can you help me? I don't understand something. And half the time, by the time I made it to their desk, they had solved the problem on their own. So again, giving them those skills to not need to go to the teacher right away with a question that they have. And finally, this last one of the tugging on the sleeve. Miss Goldman, I wanted that to stop. So, you usually think it's just the students that are causing these issues in the classroom. But I also thought about myself. Do we as teachers influence these behaviors in our students? And I was thinking about the questions that they were asking. Why were they asking so many questions? Well, maybe it's because I was always answering their questions. So the more I answer their questions right away and always give them the answers, I'm influencing them to keep asking those questions because I am giving it to them. And also along with helping students right away. A lot of times I really wanted to be that person. I wanted them to get their answers, so I would go up to them and I would help them. So as I started my research, I first wanted to put in place a routine to see how a routine would work in my classroom. So I decided to do this in my math block. And there's this thing called the do now routine. And it happens at the beginning of a block. So at the beginning of my math block, for about 10 minutes only, I had this routine. And students were usually coming in from outside the classroom to come into math, so this worked perfectly. When they walked into the room, they had a paper waiting for them on their desk. This was a worksheet that was reviewing the previous day's material, so it wasn't anything new to them, it was a review. And as they were working, they had these, the front board had the next steps available for them. So as soon as they finished that assignment, they could move on and they knew what to do. They had those next steps. And so I wanted to make this productive work time where they could self-manage themselves and complete their work. And then after only about 5 or 7 minutes, I would stop them and I'd go over that work they had done, and that was when it was time to really start the class. So I wanted to create this consistency in the classroom, something the students would be able to adjust to, and something the students would be able to adjust to. So my next slide is going to be a video. It's a video of me introducing this routine the first day. And I want you to pay close attention to the students, what they're doing, what their body language is.
At your seat, you will start working on that word the second you come sit down. And if you maybe don't understand something on the worksheet or you don't know what to answer, it's not a time for questions, trying to figure out the answers. It's just you just
is that as I'm beginning to explain the instructions, what this do now routine is going to look like, I already have students jumping out of their seats. One student's trying to walk towards me because he already wants to ask me something. I have students raising their hands in the air. I have another student in the front who already finished his work, so he wants to show it to me. And this has shown me how dependent my students are. They want my attention from the get-go. But this is something that's expected on the first day of introducing routine. The students aren't quite sure what to do yet. But my hope was over this period of lessons and this routine, my students become adjusted to it, and this dependence on the teacher would start to decrease. So I really started collecting data about my research. So after having this routine, I started taking notes about it. And I also started videotaping myself, which I was able to use this summer to analyze what my students were doing in the classroom and my role in the classroom. And so this was for about 2 weeks. And then I'll get back to writing later on in my presentation. And for writing, the data I collected were observations. I had a teacher journal. And at the end of specific lessons, I would write my observations from the class and what I noticed in my students. And I also kept field notes. I had a piece of paper where I had a chart of all my students. And every time they asked a question, I would put a check mark next to their name. And I also documented the kinds of questions that they were asking me, so I could see were specific questions repeated, or just what kind of questions are students asking me. So this summer was the time to analyze that data. So first I'll start with that math, those videos. So the video clip you saw is one I took a look at. And I was really looking at, one, the teacher's instructions. What kind of instructions were I giving them? On the first day, I gave a lot of instructions, but over time, I started taking that step back and giving less instructions and letting my students self-manage their time. Also looking at the students' questions. How many questions were students asking, and what were the type of the questions the students were asking? And I also was looking at their actions. Did students start their work right away without me prompting them? And did students move on to the next steps right away without me prompting them? And so this next slide is a little excerpt from the chart I made this summer when analyzing my data. And you can see that what's highlighted in yellow are the questions that students don't really know what to do. So they're asking these questions, like, what page should I be on? Are we supposed to be doing this problem? What do I do if I don't know something? And then there's the questions highlighted in blue, which I decided were questions the students didn't know what to do next. What do I do when I finish my worksheet? What page should I go on to next? But you can see that over time, over 10 class periods, these questions are starting to lessen. And the questions are moving away from not knowing what to do, but more questions about just, can I have a pencil or can I go to the bathroom? So over time, you can see that the students' questions are decreasing, along with the number of students that are unsure of what steps to move on to. So it's showing me that putting in place a routine and having that repetition and consistency of doing it every day really helps my students, and they're able to adjust to it, and they're able to self-manage their time and complete their work for this 10-minute period of time I had given them. And so this leads to my big finding in math. To get students into the math zone, this math atmosphere, ready to do their math, it's helpful to have a consistent routine that provides students with a mode for completing their work individually. So I brought in this do now routine that gave them this productive work time for every minute of those 10 minutes. And when I was ready to begin teaching them, they were ready. They had gotten into that math zone and they were ready to learn. So now we're going to look at writing, which I analyzed my data similarly. I was also looking at the questions that students were asking. The difference here was I didn't implement a routine. Instead, I looked at the dependent behaviors in my students so I can see how I can help students in the future. And so I started pulling apart those field notes, that chart I had made. And I looked at the types of questions that students were asking. I looked at if those questions I thought needed a teacher response, or maybe didn't need a teacher response at the time that they were asking them. And really thinking about the why behind the question. Why might these students be asking those questions? And so here's a chart I made. And I found, and so it shows the questions that students asked, a minus sign for if I thought it did not need a teacher response, and a plus sign if I thought it might need a teacher response, and some students that were asking these questions. And the questions I highlighted were the most frequently asked questions in my classroom. How do I spell this word? And what should I be writing? And the reason I gave them as they don't need teacher response is I feel like if I'm able to teach them those necessary skills to solve these questions, they will be able to do it on their own. So for how do I spell this word? Really teaching them how to use a dictionary, how to access it in the classroom, and even access the computer so they can look up at dictionary.com. Technology is so prevalent these days, teach them to use their skills with the computer as well. And also teach them to be self-confident in their spelling. Most of the time they ask these questions, it was when writing rough drafts. You don't need perfect spelling in rough drafts. So being able to use syllables to sound out their words and giving them that confidence boost to be able to write those words. And then later, when they have a conference with me about their writing, that's when I help them spell their words. And again, with what should I write? I think that it doesn't need a teacher response because if I give them those skills to help them create a wonderful graphic organizer where they're able to put all their thoughts down right away and have a web of information to look like, what their information looks like, when it comes time to write, they don't have that question of what to write about. They can look at their graphic organizer, they can pull apart what they have there, and they're ready to go. They have topics to look for. So then, with these skills, they can answer these questions on their own. So it's about me as a teacher, paying attention to the students, what the questions the students ask, so that I can know what they need to help them become successful and independent in the classroom.